Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's live stream on the Al-Jazeera documentary about war crimes investigated. A very fine documentary. I don't expect any less from Al-Jazeera, but it was one of the more difficult ones I've had to watch, even though we've been subject to a lot of that footage over the last number of months since October of 2023. Very sobering, very difficult to watch. Looking forward to discussing it with you. I'll start with a question from Leo. What do you think of Trump's plan to move all Palestinians out of Gaza and build real estate there? Well, if you have watched my review on the Bob Woodward book Rage on my main Stephen Heiner channel, you will know what I think of President Trump, which is mostly that he's all talk. He doesn't realize that in order to do things in government, you can't just sign a bunch of executive orders. That will get you some things done, surely, but that's not how you can govern a country the size and scope of the United States. You're going to have to build consensus. You're going to have to make the case of the public to the press. You're going to have to deal with the deep state. These are all things that Trump doesn't have patience for. He doesn't read books. He's not curious. He doesn't inform himself on major topics. And so when he says something like, we're going to move the people into Jordan and Egypt, firstly, there are a lot of Palestinians in Jordan, many of whom took citizenship when it was offered to them. The number of Palestinians in Jordan is so significant that they are an existential threat to the government there. So if the Jordanian government does something that's detrimental to the Palestinians, it's likely that that monarchy will be overthrown in a heartbeat. So is the Jordanian government going to accept a bunch of Palestinians to help destabilize their country? No. Egyptians with Sisi, he's propped up by America. The street in Egypt is totally opposed to what is going on. And if they were to accept it, it would radicalize that. Sisi would be overthrown. And now, instead of quote unquote solving the Gaza problem, you would have two states, Jordan and Egypt, who have popular opinion opposed and with some semblance of military and a large population. So even if Israel is going to attempt to conquer both countries, they're going to have to somehow hold millions of people hostage, which they've been able to do in the case of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but they do not have the people or the technology or world backing to take over Egypt and Jordan. So rather than create peace, this is only going to create a worse situation. But once again, Trump doesn't really understand anything going on in the world. It's all about guts. It's all about what he feels. And this is a particular situation that requires study and thoughtfulness and conferring with the proper stakeholders. And I think one of the most inspiring images we've seen in the past few days has been that line of Gazans going back home to the north. These are people who you genocided, you starved, you killed, you murdered, you raped, you tortured, and they're going home. They're going home to the land of their forefathers who've been there for centuries, and you will not stop them. It is inspiring to watch these people. I'm so often in awe, but they show you who they are every day by their actions. They don't talk. They don't need to. They just show you who they are. Anyway, let's talk about War Crimes Investigated, this documentary. Fantastic, devastating, as I said, difficult to watch. Starts by pointing out this is possibly the first live stream genocide. I would agree. What I found impressive was that Al Jazeera managed to dig up 2.5 thousand social media postings. And I loved every time I saw an IDF soldier named and shamed, I rejoiced. In part because I knew, doing some reading about this documentary, that a ton of them deleted things afterwards because they realized, perhaps I went too far. Because they thought the only people who are ever going to watch are their, fellow genocidal IDF friends on the social media. They didn't realize everyone was watching, taking notes, taking their names. And if they had dual nationality, the Hind Rajab Foundation, if you don't know about the Hind Rajab Foundation, they are now taking legal action against IDF soldiers all around the world, wherever they might be. If they're traveling, if they're dual nationals, there's a question about the legality of detaining somebody who's simply passing through your territory. So, for example, if an Israeli is in Brazil, but he doesn't have Brazilian citizenship, it's hard to convince potentially the Brazilian government to stop and detain somebody. But if the person is a dual national, you can start court proceedings against them immediately. So there's been at least one Belgian and one UK national, dual national, so they have Israeli citizenship too, who were stupid enough to brag about their crimes on social media. And I think the Hind Rajab Foundation is starting legal proceedings against them in their home countries. Now, this doesn't mean that they couldn't renounce their citizenship and go to Israel and be protected, but it does mean that they renouncing the citizenship won't get them off the hook for the crimes, because at the time that the crimes were committed, they held that citizenship. So Israel's not known for extraditing their nationals to other places, even if they've committed crimes. And as we've talked about before, there is a disproportionate number based on the population in Israel of child molesters that are in Israel and housed there, protected from extradition. Nobody has counted the death toll, so nobody can accurately estimate it. Trump said he wants to cleanse 1.5 Gazans out of Gaza. 1.5 is 800,000. I think the real number is higher. Yeah, we're not going to know for a long time, Farouk. I don't know. I don't know how we'll find out. In any case, his plan is unrealistic. So it's like asking, well, how much would it cost to move the Palestinians to the moon? It's not going to happen. What the Israelis have tried to do over the years has been stunted each time. So they were able to do the most they could in 48. They did a little bit more in 67. But ever since then, everything's just continued to be rolled back. So, and they know now they'd love to just pull up a bunch of buses and move everybody out. That's ideally what they'd like to do, but they know they can't do that. So if Israel can't do that, why would the United States be able to do that? Is Israel going to try and get the Suez Canal back? Well, because Israel never had the Suez Canal. Egypt be forced to stand by and watch this time around. Remember, they never had the Suez Canal. They had it very temporarily until the United States told them and France and Britain that they couldn't. But it's never really been anything. When you say like to get it back, it would imply that they held it for a long period of time. But they've only ever been to it very fleetingly. And I think if we think about the Suez Canal in relation to the rest of the world, what they'll put up with in terms of killing Palestinians, that's one thing. They'll allow unlimited killing of Palestinians. But in terms of stopping their world commerce, okay, now you're going to get my attention. Something else I appreciated, I'm looking for his book here, Matt Kennard, who I'm going to be doing a review of his book soon. He's featured in this documentary as well. And he pointed out that there are overflights coming from an RAF base in Cyprus, providing intelligence, and that the excuse given to the UK public was, oh, we're doing hostage searches. There are only 2 British hostages at the time, but there were 1,000 flights. So they were providing intelligence to the Israelis. So when they say this is Israel's war, no, it's the US's war, the UK's war, France's war, Germany's war. All of them provide weapons and aid and comfort to the Israelis. They all participated. The idea that this is just Israel's war is wrong, erroneous on every front. We also have AI being used here in a military format. Journalists being targeted, doctors being targeted. We found out that one of the sub programs of the AI routine was called Daddy's Home, meaning the idea was the target would be hit when he was at home with his family, because that's when he's most likely to be stationary. And they called it Daddy's Home. This is the society, this is the twisted society of decades of genocide. And what does it produce? It produces young people who dress up to mock Palestinians on social media and pretend to cry about losing their water and their electricity. And they dress up in these horrible costumes. You then also have Israelis mocking access to electricity and water. So you'll see this guy, very, very famous video at this point, he was flicking on the lights and then he was putting his mouth near the water and just running it. Of course, those of us who know that water is all stolen from the Palestinians anyway. The part originally for the Israeli state and the partition plan doesn't have access to any of that. That's part of why they're so hungry for the West Bank. The West Bank has vast hydrological resources, and that's why they have to steal them from the Palestinians. So the sort of mockery is, of course, a self-own. When you're talking about all this water you have access to, you only have water because you're stealing it from the Palestinians. The destruction of property and medical equipment. So you have documentation of them going in and just wantonly destroying property, but there's no military purpose for that. So this is a society that isn't looking for justification, and they're even willing to film themselves doing it and put it on social media. Not in a private Telegram chat, not in some local family chat. They put it on blast for the world to see. Also, a strange obsession with women's underwear. These apparently heterosexual Israeli males putting on female underwear over their military uniforms. Is that normal behavior? What does that tell you about the perverse nature of the Israeli state? Their sexual deviances, their problems. There's a lot here under the surface that's just being scratched at with just a photo here, a video there. Parading naked prisoners around, admitting to torture on camera, carving the Star of David into people's backs. This is the most moral army in the world. This is the Judeo values that the world is so gifted to have. No, thank you. Is the future surveillance state being tested out in Gaza at the moment? Cruz, if you've watched, I did a review on the Palestine Laboratory by Anthony Lowenstein, and he goes through and he documents all the different technologies that are being used for surveillance. 100%. Not only that, horribly, it's battle tested and then sold. So a lot of that technology is being sold as border surveillance technology around the world. Some of that technology has been sold to the U.S. for their Mexican border, but it has not just been used by Israel. They've commercialized it and they've sold it. So when you say the future surveillance state, I would say it's the present surveillance state. That's what's being tested out in Gaza. We have all sorts of other things that we're focused on in the documentary. We saw the execution of the World Central Kitchen civilian workers, and this got a lot of attention because it was white people being killed, not just Palestinians, and that just died off after a while. They provided their exact coordinates to the IDF, and then the IDF used those coordinates to execute them. We have reports of the doctors who wrote a letter to President Biden. They said 40-something doctors who testified to the fact that they had a number of preteen children shot in the head and torso. And of course, that didn't move the Biden administration because, I mean, Biden wasn't in charge for most of the time that he was there. We don't know who was in charge. I think we will find out in the future, but we know it wasn't him. It was off eating ice cream somewhere. But someone was making those decisions. You have dogs raping prisoners. That's talked about here, that they laid a man down, they stripped him, they sprayed something, obviously that would attract a dog, and then the dog raped the prisoner, and we have an eyewitness, someone who saw that happen. We have a young man who is a detainee who's used as a human shield. Remember, every accusation is a confession with the IDF. Whenever they say that the Palestinians did it, not only do you know the Palestinians usually didn't do it, but that they're the ones who did it. Now, in the case of human shields, there are examples, and I think the documentary showed one of Hamas using a small child as a human shield. So I'm not trying to say that Palestinians have never done that, but overwhelmingly, the use cases have been on the IDF. They're the ones who tend to use. They even had a policy, it was called the neighbor policy, and this was talked about in Avi Cohen's book, Love Israel, Support Palestine, which I reviewed on the Stephen Heiner channel some months ago, in which he talked about this policy in which you put a Palestinian in harm's way, they go knock on the door, you're standing behind them with your weapons so that you can shoot in, but you're using that person as a human shield. So remember, often with the IDF, every accusation is a confession. If they're accusing of rape, they're the ones who are doing rape. If they're accusing of human shields, they're the ones who are using human shields. It's frustrating to see big tech cap viewer counts. Most people just don't care because they don't get to see, even hear or see this information. That's interesting. I mean, I know that this channel, for example, has had some of its videos blocked just because I can see the view counts and how strange some of them are. And we fought many battles. We haven't had to on this channel because this channel's not monetized yet. But on the Steven Heiner channel, I fought and appealed a number of demonetizations based on the subject matter, almost all around Israel. And I've won most of those, strangely, as I said, because I think there are some sympathetic people in YouTube appeal moderation, and they approved most of our appeals. We're not facing that on this channel yet, but I do think we're seeing view count suppression. Now, as to whether the second point of your comment here, most people just don't care because they don't get to even see or hear this information. I do not believe that people have not seen what has happened to Gaza since October 2023. Almost everywhere on the planet that has access to the internet knows what has been happening to the Palestinians. The question is, what can people do? What are they willing to do? Now, as I've said before, we all have to do what we can within the spheres that we can. For some people, they can't say too much on social media because they'll lose their job and then they can't provide for their family. It's easy for someone like me, single with no children. I don't have as much at risk as a father, who has children, or a mother who has children. So we can't ask everybody to risk everything. But what we can do is try to educate ourselves and educate others and try to make changes, participate in BDS, share information with people, contribute to things like the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. But the idea that people don't know what's going on, that's not true. The question is, what are they willing to do with the information they have? And I think for most people, not much. There's just other things that interest them more. And it's not for me to make a judgment as to whether that's right or wrong. But based on what I've observed since October of 2023, I think that's just the facts. Is the recent release of hostages considered a PR victory? Well, for who, Cruz? I think it's certainly a victory for Hamas. And it's a huge victory in the sense of the Israelis were told by their government that all these people were being raped and they were probably all dead and they were suffering from malnutrition. And all of them, we get all these photos and they're smiling, almost as if they were treated according to the rules of international law by Hamas. And then we get the photos of the Palestinians who were jailed by the Israelis, and we see they're disfigured, they're missing fingers, they've grown white hair when before they had a full head of black hair. Now, you're not going to see that because who cares about Palestinians? But I think the problem is the Israelis have a really hard time spinning happy, smiling hostages, mostly alive, coming home. So it's not just a PR victory for Hamas, but all of whom looked really good, by the way. I don't know if you saw those uniforms with those weapons that they took from the Israelis. I mean, is there anything better than seeing Hamas soldiers armed with Israeli weapons looking good? Not for me, no. But the Israelis were told all this time that all their hostages were dead and being raped. So they come to realize their government was lying to them. And that's something that the Israeli society has to deal with. So not only was it a PR victory externally for Hamas, it's a dagger to Israeli public opinion. What are they going to do with a government that's been lying to them? That's up to them. Teresa, I don't think the idiotic idea is a go. Teresa, I talked about this a little earlier on the stream when you see it on the replay. Catherine, I noticed the view count changes based on the login. Yeah, and subscribers come and go. That's just how it is. What will happen to the Palestinians in the West Bank if it is annexed? It is effectively annexed now. It's been effectively annexed since 1967. So the settler policy has gotten more brazen in recent years, but we've had settlements since 67, which is all illegal. So they're not allowed citizenship or any kind of residence rights. They're not given any real rights as is now. So if it were annexed legally, and I was going to say that Israel would have some kind of international pressure, and then I stopped myself because Israel doesn't care about international pressure, so it doesn't matter. But there's no reason why the situation wouldn't just go on indefinitely with them being pushed more and more into pressurized situations, as what's going on in Gaza. So Gaza has all of these people in a very concentrated area. The West Bank has more people in a less concentrated area, but as the settlements encroach, you can start to see that same kind of crushing action that's happening to the Gazans. But really, I really have no idea what's going to happen at the moment. I just know that the idea of everyone being evacuated to Jordan and Egypt is a no-go, just from Egypt and Jordan's side. And Israel, as much as they would love the US to force that, they don't have the power to do that themselves. That's a dream scenario for them. And then what they'd want is for Jordan and Egypt to attack, and then they take it all over. But they don't have what it takes to hold all that land. They're trying to take additional land in Syria now, but they really don't have what it takes to hold it. They have a mostly reservist military. And a lot of them, as you saw in this documentary, a lot of them are wounded, have PTSD. Those people used to have functional parts. They had jobs, they ran businesses in Israeli society. They went to Gaza, they got killed and maimed. And now they have to try to re-enter Israeli society. How does Israeli society build from that? They're experiencing in a small way what the Palestinians have been experiencing for decades. Israeli society is coping with a not small number of their young men wounded, traumatized, handicapped for life, and no longer contributing to their economy. How long is that going to sustain? Everything's paused right now, but we don't know what it's going to look like months from now. I recently heard that much of Palestine land was owned by rich people overseas, some of which Israel purchased. Do you know what percentage was stolen and not purchased? Alex, that's a great question. I've covered this before in different reviews. So I'm going to refer you to One Palestine Complete by Tom Segev. I did 3 reviews. I did that review in 3 parts on my main channel. It's also actually referenced in the book that I just did this week, Israeli Apartheid, A Beginner's Guide. But in brief, up until 1948, only 6% of the private land was owned by the Jews. But the UN mandate gave them 55% of the land. So people who owned 6%, and they were a minority of the population, were given the majority of the land. So the Israel lobby, it's got tentacles that go way back. It isn't some new thing. But you're right that, let me put your comment back up. Rich people overseas. So what you have to understand is that Palestine, along with the rest of the Levant, so the Lebanon and Syria, were part of a district in the Ottoman Empire, and private land ownership, as we might know it, if you're speaking from a Western perspective or other parts of the world that have that concept of private land ownership, that didn't come to the Ottoman Empire until very late in the game and towards the end of the empire. And what they did was they simply established deeds for a lot of places in which people had lived for centuries. They hadn't bought the land. They just lived there, and they lived there for centuries, and their people lived there for forever, much like serfdom worked in Europe during the medieval times and built Europe into this glorious thing. So people who live on a land, they feel a sense of ownership to it. They feel tied to it. It doesn't matter that someone else owns, quote unquote, owns the land. That doesn't matter. What matters is I live there. I work there. It pays me. It feeds me. My family lives here. I love it. So when that happened, Ottoman land deeding across that part of the empire, it is true that rich families were the ones who could purchase that land from the Ottomans and have it deeded. And it is true that not only those rich overseas families, but some Palestinians, and this is documented in The Iron Cage by Rashid Khalidi. I did a 2-part review on that, I think, on the Stephen Heiner channel. Some Palestinians sold that land to the Jews too. Now, it wasn't necessarily prime real estate, but land was being sold to the Zionists by both Palestinians in the present tense who were living there, who had extra land, and they wanted the money. They didn't really realize what the threat the Jews were, or even if they did realize it, they didn't care. They're just in it for themselves. And there were some overseas landlords, people who lived elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire, who held that land and who sold it. But in any case, what's in dispute is not the land that was legally sold. People are allowed to buy and sell land. What's in dispute is the fact that Israel kicked a bunch of people out from their villages and said that it was war. And so when war happens, we get to take everything over. And that's the narrative that they've kept up to the present day. But we have too much evidence that that there was no war. As we note, if you want to look at Benny Morris's The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, it's a review I've done in 2 parts on the Stephen Heiner channel. 300,000 Palestinians were expelled prior to May the 15th, 1948, inside the UN partition for the state of the Jewish state. So the idea is, we don't want any non-Jews in the Jewish state, so you're getting out. These were people who were unarmed. They lived in villages. If they had a gun, it was one gun for like 50 villagers. And it was then classified as an enemy base. And so they could be murdered, expelled, have their houses bombed, their remains mined. And any people who came back to get their crops were shot on sight. We have all the evidence of this. And the Israelis want us to believe whatever they tell us, which is mostly a bunch of lies. Mostly, I mean, it's all lies. Teresa, UN mandate also gave Jews the more fertile lands too. UN countries were threatened and bribed to get them to vote yes on the resolution, as reported in Alison Weir's Against Our Better Judgment. Thank you, Teresa. I appreciate the assist there. I have reviews for Alison Weir's book, both on this channel as well as on the Stephen Heiner channel. The one on this channel is a shorter one. I want to say 20, 25 minutes. And the one on the Stephen Heiner channel is maybe 45 minutes. It's a more extensive review. Alex, thank you. I was indeed wondering about modern land deeded ownership. I'll look up Israeli apartheid, Rashid Khalidi's book. There's a bunch of stuff, Alex. And hopefully my goal is that, having done some of this work for you, you can just watch some of my videos, get some ideas about some of these things, and then go and research it more yourself. That's hopefully what we're doing with the bookshelf, is we're providing people with the resources to study themselves. One of the reviews I'm going to be, I recorded it, but you'll see it in a while, is this report from B'Tselem about the prison conditions inside Israeli prisons. And it's some of the most horrible reading I've had to do for the channel, but it's really important. And part of that is understanding what is the mentality of such a people. And Gideon Levy talks about this in The Punishment of Gaza, talks about the killing of Gaza. These, again, I keep referring to books I've already reviewed. I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I'm just pointing out these are places you can go to learn more. He points out that this is a two-way trauma. The Israelis are inflicting a trauma on the Palestinians, but you can't do that without hurting your soul and hurting the soul of the society you come from. And that's why we see that feedback loop. This is a really insanely sick society in which the men in military uniform put on women's lingerie, the Palestinian women's lingerie, to mock them, and yet not realizing they're revealing their own deviancies and their strangeness. They are mocking we have in this video people dancing to music saying, "May your village burn." This is a very sick society, and yet they're trying to tell us that they're going to be a light to the nations. They're God's chosen people, that God promised them this land. And yet this is the behavior that they enact. But part of it is, and again, I want to point out, this is from a supremacist notion that is not simply a Zionist thing, but is within Talmudic Judaism, which is that they are all here to serve us, that we are your slaves. There is a future when the Messiah comes when all the Goyim will serve the Jews. And so the supremacist notion is not simply Zionistic. It is within Talmudic Judaism. And so people have to get out from their head, oh, it's just the Zionist problem. And if we get rid of the Zionists, we can live with the Jews in peace. Like, no, Talmudic Judaism is fundamentally opposed to the rest of the world. It's them ruling all of us. And once people understand that a bit more, they'll understand this is not just a passing movement of Zionism. There's much, much more about it. All right. Are there any other thoughts from people who had a chance to watch the documentary? If you haven't, I really hope that this discussion has inspired you to watch it. It's not long. I want to say it's an hour and 20 minutes, and quite difficult to watch at times. I was particularly moved by the scene in which the mother sees her son shot by an Israeli sniper in front of him. And he calls back to her. And you always think of these battlefield scenes in which a man is dying and he's calling for his mother. This is frequently written about all around the world in all sorts of cultural contexts. And this young man, oh, mother, I've been hit. And then they shoot him a couple more times. And this mother has to watch her son be executed in front of her by the Israelis. And yet all throughout, there is so much theological language coming from the mouths of these people, from very young to very old. When they say in the name of God or God's will or whatever else, this deep reference. Obviously, I'm not a Muslim. I do not adhere to the Islamic religion, but I cannot help but have a natural respect for these people's theological reference within their lives. That for them there is a through line for why these things are happening, and a reference point in their own lives for it, and it's admirable to see. Um, and it's constant. I see it in every historical context. It's not just something a documentary I've watched here in Al Jazeera, this week. It's books I've read about Palestinians in the 1910s or in the 1940s or in the 1960s, or watching Hassan Kanafani on camera in the 70s. Um, have you read Goliath by Max Blumenthal? Leo, no, it's you can't see it, but it's back here. It's about 4 books out, which means probably March or April. Don't hold me to it. That's part of why I don't publish a list of what I'm working on, because sometimes another book comes in that needs to be read first. But I have Goliath. It's back there. It's moving forward. I will get to it. But for those who haven't read it, I think the subtitle is maybe Fear and Loathing in the West Bank, but it talks about the occupation, which is something that um, is important. Jacob Stein, the Palestinians are leaving, so the war crimes are over. No, Jacob, the war crimes continue in the West Bank, where settlers break international law on a daily basis and murder and threaten and torture people with impunity. So, unfortunately, the war crimes are not over, and the Palestinians aren't leaving. If you mean they're leaving Rafah to go back to their homes in the north, that's true. But the war crimes aren't over. As long as the IDF exists, war crimes can't end. Cruz, is Judaism henotheistic? Cruz, I'm worried my Greek may not be enough to know what heno is there. If you can help me out. Any other questions in the chat before we wrap up today? Before any Zionist bots decide that they're going to occupy the chat as they so often like to do. Broken hearts from Catherine and Farouk. Yes. But again, as I said, great admiration for the fortitude of the Palestinian people, and we can only hope that something develops. One of the phrases that I remember Murid Al-Barghouti talks about in I Saw Ramallah, a review that I did on the main channel, Stephen Heiner channel, a phrase that the Palestinians had between in the 50s and the 60s was they wanted to wait until things got clearer. For them, there was always the sense of disruption, that things would develop, things would get clearer. But I've come to think that that phrase has never really gone away. The idea is, when will things be clearer? It's uncertain. And we're clearly in a developing phase now. And the question is, what will develop? Pray for the people of Gaza, of all denominations, for their well-being and their safety. And if you can in any way, as I said, we here on this channel specifically, we support the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. So I would really encourage you to send them money to help Palestinian children get medical care. But I also want to promote, particularly regarding this documentary, the Hin Rajab Foundation. And I think it just might be hinrajabfoundation.org. Use Google, you can find it. But prosecuting IDF soldiers who have dual nationality in their countries of other nationalities, making sure that they're prosecuted there, that they have to either renounce, they'll probably have to flee back to Israel. Israel will keep them, as they do all of their criminals, safe from international law. But at least something will be done to impede their freedom of movement. If they want to kill Palestinians with impunity, that's fine. They just have to stay in Israel. But the idea that they can go on vacation to Brazil and elsewhere celebrating their genocide, that has to end. And I think that's well within our grasp. And there are limits to what the lobby can do. Henotheism, adherence to one particular god out of several, especially by a family, tribe, or other group. Uh, well, Judaism purports to be monotheistic. It's just that the mono god in their system has appointed them as the master race over everyone else. So I don't think we could say they're henotheistic. But if you want to develop your argument a little bit more, perhaps in another stream, I would love to talk to you more about it. You're welcome, Missy. Will they release Marwan Barghouti? Alex, I don't know. I'm not as plugged in on individual cases. The people who I would refer to, who I feel like are always on the cutting edge of this, are the people at the Electronic Intifada. So if you want to follow situations like that, they're the people who I think are going to have the most up-to-date information. Okay, last questions. Thank you all for staying. It's been a good stream today. Great questions, great points. I appreciate you joining me. All right. I will try to afterwards link to some of the videos and places I recommended, including, as I said, the Hin Rajab Foundation and the Palestine Children's Relief Fund in the description of the video. I'll have to wait till everything finishes streaming. But those of you who come back later and watch the stream, feel free to join the conversation by adding comments and sharing resources that other people can learn. This is what this project is. It isn't just me talking. It's me learning from you all and trying to share those resources back. Thanks, everybody, and we will see you next week.